My name is Cameron Buckner, and this is the Dixiecryptid YouTube channel podcast thingy. So glad you clicked on the video. I was recording these two stories, and both stories are really good. And at the end, I kind of did my every 3 or 4 month little thing about true stories or these true stories, etc. And I got a little carried away, and I kind of went on a rant. And I thought about just taking it all out of the video, but heck, I'm just gonna leave it in. You guys listen to my rant if you want to, but it's at the very end. Right now, let's get into some stories, and I hope you guys enjoy this podcast because I sure love putting it together, even though I got a little pissed off at the end. So if you guys are ready, let's get it rolling. All right, here we go. All right. Here's a story from the outback, from Australia, from one of my mates in Australia. And I'm going to tell you up front, first, it's a good story, but second, there's some words in here I'm going to mispronounce, so everybody get right by their keyboard and get ready to correct me right away, because I'm going to blow it. I know I'm going to blow it, and I'm telling you ahead of time. I'm not real smart, but I'm not stupid, but sometimes I mispronounce some words, and sometimes I kind of like mispronouncing words. I don't know. It's kind of fun to do. But here's what he wants to be anonymous, and here's what he writes. And get ready for a good story here. I'm almost 47 now, but this happened many years ago. I think I was 18 at the time. While some details are a bit fuzzy, others are as clear as yesterday. Things were different when I was growing up than they are today. Back then, kids seemed to have a lot more freedom to run around in the bush from a young age and with a lot more carefree ease. It doesn't seem the same today. It used to be nothing to go off in the bush on a motorbike and disappear for a week. Mine was a family of hunters, fishermen, and shooters. I learned all these things from a young age, so I was always comfortable in the bush, be it just poking around with my mates or enjoying all the outdoor sports or camping or getting up into mischief. Nothing scared me. Day or night, the wildlife caused no fear. There were things for which we had a healthy respect for, such as brown snakes and cranky boars, but there was nothing that would stop us getting out there and having a great time. One of the things we loved doing as kids was to load up our dirt bikes and head off into the bush camping and riding. Our parents would happily haul our bikes out to the drop-off points and send us on our way. We tied our school bags together to make saddlebags, and we loaded our backpacks with anything that wouldn't fit in the school bags, and we had our eskies sitting on our fuel tanks between our legs. It must have been a sight. I'm not sure what an esky is, and I think I pronounced that right, but they had eskies on their fuel tanks between their legs. If we planned to be out for a while, we often had to make 2 trips, or we would visit the town of Udalo, about 10 kilometers away, for more fuel and supplies, much to the disgust of the local cop from Palmwoods, another nearby town, who never managed to catch us riding our bikes on the road, try as he might. Udalo is located out behind the Sunshine Coast in the hinterland in Queensland. It used to be a lot quieter than it is these days. It was a rural area with thick bush everywhere. We'd set up camp in or near a large cave that was just below the top of the ridgeline system that ran between the Glenview area and the Udalo area, maybe a good half-hour bike ride between the two. We had always camped at the Udalo end, in or above the cave, but this time we came in from the Glenview side, and we decided to make camp on top of a spur that was on a branching track. Now by track, I mean a bike or a horse trail. It was just a small clearing before a steep decline into the north. The track ran south and back up to the main ridge system where we would access the track that we liked to ride. To the east and west, the landscape also fell away into deep, heavily wooded valleys. We used to rough it, but it was still quite a comfortable camp. We set up in a triangle formation with the 3-man tent forming one corner the fire forming the second, and the third formed by a blue tarp and hammocks hung from trees. We were surrounded by knee-high, blady grass. My girlfriend at the time was living in Utilo, so it was inevitable that I would get her on the back of the bike and bring her up. It was toward the end of the trip, and two of the guys headed into town for supplies. It was late afternoon, and I was glad to have time alone with my girlfriend. It was quiet, and we hung around camp and enjoyed each other's company. As the day drew to a close, we lit the fire and cooked what little we had left. We had thought the others would have been back before dark, but we weren't concerned. They knew their way back and forth very well. Sometime after dark, we decided to jump in the tent and enjoy what alone time we had left. Alone time was not what we got. We couldn't have been in there long because the fire was still burning well enough to throw a fair amount of light on the side of the tent, and something moving around in the grass to the west of us got my attention. I figured it was one of a myriad of animals that make up the night shift in Australia, and at worst, I thought it might be a couple of wild dogs drawn to our camp by the cooking smells. My girlfriend was the one who said, "I think I can hear someone talking." Let me do this in my Australian. "I think I hear someone talking around the tent." It's not a very good accent, but I gave it a whirl. My first reaction was to tell her that it was the night sounds of the bush and to ignore it, but then I really started listening. That was when I heard the sounds that she was already zeroing in on, and she was right. It was bipedal footsteps that we were hearing. Steady, sure, and certain footsteps through the blady grass. First it was 4 or 5 steps and then a pause, and then some more, and then another pause. It was circling our camp. Who would be out this fall circling our camp in the dark? I wondered aloud. At this point, she was becoming a little afraid. I was running through possible solutions and trying to figure out what kind of animal it might be. At a loss for anything else, I now believe it was someone who, for whatever reason, was walking around our camp. Although I don't remember exactly what we were saying throughout the encounter, we were whispering back and forth so quietly we were barely making a sound. Mainly, we were intensely concentrating on the activity around us. The only real loud statement I made was, "We can hear you, mate. You better get going because we have a knife." After that, the walking got heavier with no more pauses. It was almost like whoever it was decided that they'd been sprung and no longer had to hide their intent. When it went around to the west side of the camp, I quickly unzipped the screen, pushed back the flap, and grabbed the tomahawk from its place just outside the entrance. Meanwhile, whoever was continuing his march around the camp without breaking stride, step, 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 stop. My girlfriend jerked the tomahawk from my hand, and I didn't argue with her. If it was giving her some comfort, then let her have it. I quietly fumbled until I found a buck knife among my things, and the knife and the tomahawk were our only defense. We didn't have guns with us, but by now I was becoming more and more concerned. I thought about opening the tent and making a break for it, thinking the two of us could slip out into the dark and hide. I'm so glad we didn't. Whoever this wasn't stupid. They would swing right in close to the back of the tent on the west side where it was darker, and then move wide and more down the slope as they circled to the east where the fire was. I remember, too, that I could hear all the crickets in the grass stop chirping progressively as it made its way around the camp. All of these little details are coming back only now as I write this. I worked up the courage to peer out of the little gap between the screen and the flap on the back window of the tent, and what I saw froze me in fear. Nothing in the bush does that to me, and my girlfriend saw it too. I heard her gasp, and then I couldn't even hear her breathing. All I could hear was my heart thumping in my ears. I felt my girlfriend move, so I put my hand on her to keep her from getting out, but that wasn't necessary. She positioned herself in the dead center of the tent and sat there shaking in the dim light and clutching the tomahawk to her chest. I thought about that tent. We may as well have been wrapped in paper. I couldn't even speak, and I wanted to say to her that I was sorry and let her know that I was about as scared as she was, but the words wouldn't come. The image of what I had seen kept running through my mind. I'm almost certain that it saw us looking out at it because it stopped, and it stood there still as a rock. I peered back out, hoping that it had been a trick of my brain, but it was still there and it wasn't moving. There was enough light from the rapidly dying fire to make it out, and it was no man. I couldn't see its face in the dim light, but there was no mistaking it. It was 7 feet tall, maybe taller. It was covered in hair or fur. I couldn't tell what color it was except that it was dark. Its round, wide head was stuck right on top of its shoulders that were twice as wide as me, with no sign of ears. Its arms were long and thick with hands that dropped down to its knees. I couldn't make out any details in the hands, but I could tell they were hands. The chest was as wide as the shoulders, but it tapered down to the hips a bit. It didn't make a sound as we watched it. It didn't move. I couldn't smell anything like I've heard with a lot of Yowie stories. As far as I could tell, there was only the one, but it wouldn't have mattered if there had been 10 of them. One would have been enough to roll us over like a truck. I think it was waiting for the fire to die, and in my mind, going out there and building up the fire wasn't an option. It was a real damned if you do and damned if you don't situation. It was about then that I heard a bike off in the distance to the south of us. I didn't take my eyes off the creature, though. I couldn't tell what my girlfriend was doing, but I could feel her tense behind me and stop shaking for a couple of seconds, so I knew she'd heard it too. I saw this thing turn its body toward the south. I didn't know what was going to happen. Was it going to rush in and have us? The noise of the bike got slowly louder, and there were flashes of light through the trees that were beginning to bounce off the tent. Still, I didn't take my eyes off of this creature. At that moment, it gave off a growl that lasted quite a long time. It vibrated in my chest, and despite the fact that it wasn't ear-piercingly loud. Then it turned directly west and strode down the slope into the low country beside the spur. And as the lights and the full noise of the bikes rounded the top of the hill, it was gone. It wasn't until then that I felt like I started to breathe again. My girlfriend showed signs of calming, but she was still shaking. The bike stopped at our campsite, and I heard one of my mates say, "You idiot, the fire's almost dead." I went out first. My girlfriend didn't come out until 5 minutes later, when the fire was roaring again, and her violent shakes now were a slight shiver. My other mate looked at us and asked what was wrong. "Did you have a fight or something, mate?" he asked. I uttered one sentence. There was something out here walking around our camp when it got dark. They both laughed and called us names. My girlfriend gave me a look before moving over to whisper in my ear that she wanted to go home. All the while, the other two were exclaiming how treacherous it was riding the tracks in the dark and how stupid they'd been for starting their run back so late. My one mate even said he'd considered pulling up and lighting a fire to camp for the night. And my girlfriend looked at me and I could see fear in her eyes. And I said I would build a fire and not sleep all night, and that led to more ridicule from my mates. Years later, the older mate said that it was shortly after this point that he could see we were serious, but it wasn't until morning that he had to admit something was amiss and he couldn't explain it. That night, I had the fire roaring, and I gathered up every bit of timber I could find near the campsite, constantly flashing my camp torch in wide arcs as I did so. My two mates were convinced I'd gone mad. My girlfriend curled up and slept in the open entrance of the tent, and my back mere centimeters from her. I didn't sleep a wink. As the sun came up, I was both mentally and physically exhausted. I had spent the whole night sitting up, straining my ears for every little sound, but there was nothing. It never came back that I know of. And as soon as it was daylight, we looked around the camp. There it was, a well-trodden path in the grass, just like I'd described its movements earlier. Every now and then we could see where it had strayed from its path and would make big strides in the blady grass. My girlfriend wouldn't come and look. She gave me a look that said, "I want to pack up and leave here." Well, I felt the same, and quickly, that was exactly what we did. I never told my other mate what we saw in fine detail. He asked once and suggested that it was probably some feral hermit that was tramping around up there. They aren't that uncommon in places like that, and I was happy to leave it there, but I know what we saw. My girlfriend and I never discussed it again either. She eventually moved to another state and we lost touch. I've tried a couple of times to find her on Facebook without success. It was more out of curiosity than anything. I have no idea what I'd say to her about it now anyway. Apart from that, I've never told this story in its entirety without anonymity to anyone other than my dad, my best mate, and my now ex-wife. My dad, my best mate, have their own stories on the subject, but that's for them to tell. You don't spend as much time in the bush as we have and not have some weird stories to tell. As for me, I've never seen or heard anything like it since, but, and there's always the big but, about 12 years ago I was hunting a block in Upper Caboolture, Caboulture, Caboolture. Aussies, help me out. Another place in Australia that's yielded a lot of yowie stories. I was hunting right up on the flowing gully that was thick, looking for wild pigs or wild dogs when, as I crept along, I noticed that the whole place went dead silent. There was not a sound. I had a terrible feeling of dread, and I'd only had that feeling once before, the night that I just related to you. I had a gun on this night with good hot loads, but looked on it as being inadequate. And immediately I racked one, put the hammer in half cock, and I walked out of there at a fast pace, my thumb on the hammer the whole way to the car. I didn't bag that gun until I was out of the gate and on the main road. After that experience, I never went back. I still head out a fair bit by myself. It's the most effective way to hunt wild dogs. But when I do, I carry a 270 WSM everywhere. I don't go off into the bush without a good center field rifle in my hands. It's easy to explain away as I've never known when a dog or big boar will be present. But it's also because I never want to feel that helpless in the bush again. Well, that's my story, and I hoped you liked it. And some people will put it down as rubbish, but I lived it. And that's the end. And brother, you did live it. Whew, man. And listen, me doing the goofy little, my attempt at an Aussie accent is not to make fun of Australians. I don't think a single Australian would think I was doing that. And they're probably laughing at me now, but I ain't scared to try things. I love their accent. I wish I could imitate it, but it's not to make fun of Aussies. The only people that will be offended are probably Americans, and people are probably rolling their eyes. But I had fun with it, and that's the thing. So, also, my Australian mates, I'm just playing around, All right, thank you for the story, sir. Let's move on to another one. Here is an email from a man named BJ, and here's what he writes. It's a pretty good story. I really enjoyed reading this. Now that my family has passed away, I can finally tell our story. In 1900, my family came from Russia and Germany to homestead up near the Canadian border. There, my great-grandfather cleared trees and started our farm. Back then, there were no chainsaws to cut the trees, nor any heavy equipment to move them once they were down. Fields were plowed by the collaboration of man and animal, and then planted and harvested by hand. It meant long hours of hard work, but somehow my great-grandparents pulled that farm out of the sweat of their brow. In 1910, my great-grandmother was staying in town, caring for a sick uncle. My great-grandfather was working on a large wagon when it started to roll. He tried to stop it, but it was too big. He fell under it, and it rolled over his legs, pinning him to the ground. He screamed with all his might, but Grandma was in town and nobody else was around to hear him. The sun began to slowly sink beyond the grassy fields, and he heard a noise behind him in the trees. He was in severe pain and unable to move, and he was becoming sleepy. He fought the overwhelming need to close his eyes, but he soon lost the fight and he drifted into unconsciousness. The next morning he was awakened by a hand behind his head, and drops of water were hitting his dry, parched lips. He put his hand on the unknown person's hands for more water. Then he drifted between sleep and awareness, and he opened one eye to see someone dark looking down at him. He couldn't figure out who it was, and his eyes were blurry from sleep, and he was severely dehydrated from lack of water, but he knew there were no dark folks living anywhere near him. A minute later, his vision began to focus, and he realized he was looking at something he had never seen before. He tried to back away, but his legs weren't working, and he was overwhelmed by fear, and he passed out. He didn't wake up again until the next morning. He was laying there contemplating what he should do when he realized his legs were free of the clutching wagon wheel. "There's no way I lifted that wagon off myself," he said to himself aloud. "But how did I get free? Even now I can't move." He saw something dark peek its head around a tree, and fear gripped him like a vice. He tried to swallow, but his throat was as dry as the sands in the desert. He was trembling with dread as he thought, "What kind of beast is this?" My grandfather began to pray for the Lord to protect him as the creature began to move toward him in small, uncertain steps. It moved slowly forward until it was standing right over my grandfather. Then it held out its hand, and in it was a big chunk of moss. The feeling of strangling fear vanished as my grandfather realized this was the dark man he had seen before. The beast knelt down and squeezed the moss while holding my grandfather's head so he could drink the water dripping. Then the beast disappeared into the trees, but it soon returned with a skinned-out squirrel. It tore off bits of meat and fed it to my grandfather. After an hour, the beast picked up my grandfather and headed toward the farmhouse, and it laid him on the front porch with the moisture-soaked moss next to him. A couple hours after that, the sound of a trotting horse and wagon came down the road, and it was my great-grandmother and her nephew, Eugene. They pulled up, and Grandma ran to Grandpa asking what had happened, and he told her the whole story and of the new friend they had made. This would be the first of many interactions my family had with a family of Sasquatch living nearby, all the way up until the 1980s. I am handicapped now, so I'm unable to type well. It may take some time to tell them all. At least now I can finally tell our story. And that's the end. Can y'all see why I like that story? Oh man, it was great. I mean, I love the old stories that come from, he said this happened in the early 1900s. I thought it was fantastic. And now I'm going to do my, I have to do this about 3 or 4 times a year and explain to people, because we get a lot of new people listening and questions come. Most of the time the questions are just pretty bland and vanilla. You know, hey, are these true? How do you know if they're true? Blah, blah, blah. Some of them are pretty nasty. I got into it with some guy in the comment section. I shouldn't do that, but they really piss me off sometimes, and I like to, when they insult me, I like to insult them back. This guy was just real adamant about how we should be more diligent about making sure that these stories are true. He's probably one of these Bigfoot purists who, has this omniscient ability to be able to tell what stories are true and which ones aren't. I can't tell that. I don't know which ones are true and which ones aren't. And so here's my quarterly announcement to the audience. I don't know. I've got 300, I'm pushing 400 videos up right now. Out of 400, 390 of them are story videos. I have no idea if any of these stories are true. There's no way for me to check them, and there's no way to vet them. And when people challenge me on that, I put it back to them. If you can show me one Bigfoot story that you can prove without a doubt that's true, then we'll talk. We'll talk, and maybe you can rub some of that magic off on me so that I can figure out how these are true. But I can't do it. And so when people send me stories, I read them. You have to decide if they're true. I don't consider it my job to figure out which one of these are true and which ones aren't, because like this story we just read, it is an outlandishly crazy story. But could it have happened? Absolutely, it could have happened. If you believe Bigfoot exists, then you have to believe at least believe that this story could have happened. And if it did happen or didn't happen, it does not matter to me. What matters to me is, was it a good story? It was a fantastic story. And on the off chance that this is true, and I'm not saying it isn't, I'm not saying it is. On the off chance that this story is true, wouldn't it be a waste if I just took this story and put it in my trash folder? It would have been a waste and a shame to leave this story out of this podcast. So there you have it. There's I have to do this some people ask me if the Steve Lilly stories are true. If I do a fictional story, I'm going to tell you it's fiction. And if I don't tell you it's fiction, I'm kind of assuming that you know it's fiction by the way it's written, by stating who the author is and telling you that he has 24 books out right now. I love to read stuff by other authors. It's fun. It's ready to go. It helps them sell books. It gives me material to include in the podcast. And so sometimes when people ask me, are the Steve Lilly stories true? I'll come back with, really? Are you really asking me that question? And I think it insults them when I do that. And that's not what, I don't mean that way. I'm like flabbergasted that anybody would think one of those Steve Lilly stories is true. But to answer your question, they're not true. They're fiction. They're made up in my twisted imagination, and they're fun to write. They're fun stories. And look, guys, we can have fun with this Bigfoot topic every once in a while. It doesn't have to be like the Bigfoot purists make it. It can be fun. People can have fun with this. And if they don't like it, they don't have to listen. But I think I'm getting a little bit off topic, but I just wanted to be clear. I don't do any of these stories trying to pass off something that I know is false as true. I'm not being dishonest. I would never try to do that. I'm straight up with everybody, and I tell everybody, I have no idea if a single story I have ever read, even the ones told to me by other people that I've written stories around, I have no idea if they're true, but they're damn good stories. They're damn good stories, and I love doing them. So that's the deal with this channel. And if you don't like that, don't comment. Don't comment and give me your opinion on if we should do vetted true stories or not. Because there's no one can prove a story is true. Do it. If you think you can do it. Show it to me. So don't comment and give me that bullcrap. Let's just enjoy a good story. Everybody relax. Let's have a good time. You can tell I'm a little aggravated at some of these people, and it's 99% of the comments on my channel are fabulous. We have the nicest people on the internet, but there's 1 out of 1,000 that'll pop up, and I don't know where these people come from. I got an email the other day from some guy. He's all bent out of shape because I spend 30 seconds in 2 videos per month, and I talk about Yeti bar soaps. And he says he's not going to listen anymore because he has to fast forward 3 or 4 minutes through to get past it. Now, you think he's overstating that a little bit? So my response to him, I'd love to tell you his name because he's a real jackass, but I'm not going to do that. I don't want to draw attention to him, and I'll bet you he's listening. I bet you he's listening because sometimes they just can't go away. But my response to him was, the only person I really want to lose this week from my podcast is you, brother. You're the only one I want to lose. I do these Yeti Bar ads for the Yeti brothers, not because there's any money in it, because there isn't any money in it. They pay me a little stipend, a little bitty piece of a sale. If you use that DC10 code, that makes me an affiliate with their company. But hey, if it really hacks you guys off that I talk about my buddies, the Yeti brothers and their soaps, there are other podcasts doing ads for them now. Nance at Buckeye Bigfoot, Neoma Finn with the Neoma Finn channel, Brian with Sasquatch Odyssey, he's doing ads for them. You guys use their codes. Don't use my code, use their codes. I do these ads because I love these guys and I want to see their business do well. Sometimes when I talk about their soap, they get a big boost in sales. I don't know why. I don't know why anybody listens to me, but it's a great product. It really is a great product, and it's the only soap I use. Now, I'm not saying my wife does. She has her own soaps that she uses. But as a dude, I love the way those soaps smell, and I use them. But don't use the code DC10 if it really gets under your skin that I'm helping these guys try to build their business. It just blows me away that people can't take a 30-second little, I guess it's an ad for two guys hustling, trying to make a soap company go. So to show you that it's not for the money, use somebody else's code. Give it all to, use Neoma Finn's code or Nance's code or Brian at Sasquatch Odyssey. Lily, what are you barking at? Use their code and let the commissions go to them because I don't care about it. But I'm going to continue to help those guys. And about every third or fourth podcast, I'm going to talk about those soaps because they're just good people. And I love good people. And if I can help good people, I'm going to do it. Oh man, that turned into a rant. How about let's go to another story? I tell you what, I may just put this at the end. I may put this story at the end so that it doesn't interrupt the whole podcast. So I had planned on putting this story first, but I've got a story from the Outback from an Aussie who sent me a really good story. I'm going to go record it. We're going to put it in front. All right, you guys have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you on the next podcast. Love you guys. See you then.